So this workshop is called The Story of Yoga, and it's a history of yoga, but history, the word, I think, has associations in people's mind from high school or college that are dry and boring and filled with dates and facts. And this story, this history or herstory or story is not dry and boring. It's one of the least boring stories that I know of in the world. So the story of yoga will start out a bit more historical, and then we'll get more and more kind of juicy with the stories of real people, you know, who actually created the ideas and practices that constitute the complex tradition that we call yoga. Because, of course, traditions don't emerge out of nowhere, fully formed. They're actually organically created over time by real human beings. So I'm interested in those real human beings. I'm interested in how these teachings and practices came about as an expression of the lived experience of real human beings, as opposed to seeing them as doctrines or dogmas or fixed belief systems. And yoga is not a religion in that sense. Now, yoga overlaps with many different religions. So the most useful diagram when talking about Indian religions or Asian spirituality generally is the Venn circle diagram, where you have overlapping circles, you know, because yoga is a form of spiritual practice, primarily, that overlaps with a bunch of different South Asian religions and now world religions. So it overlaps with what is now called Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism, as well as other Indian traditions you might not have heard of. And in time it even came to overlap with Islam. When Islam came to India, Sufi lineages adopted yoga to some extent or another. And nowadays it even overlaps with other religions too. We have, you know, people doing or at least attempting a kind of Christian yoga and so on. So that is not really invalid, because yoga itself, as primarily a system of practice, a system, I'll define it in a general sense as a system of psychophysical practice, meaning a system of practice that utilizes the mind-body connection, that the mind-body connection is primary and central to this practice we call yoga. That's what sort of distinguishes it. That's why we can't just call any form of spiritual practice yoga, truly speaking. It really refers to a practice that works with the mind-body connection, and connection is really sort of the key word in yoga. Yoga itself means connection, among other things. You might have heard it defined as union and other things, but really connection and or integration, those are the primary operative meanings in the actual practice of yoga. So, since yoga itself, you know, as a tradition, declares itself to be optionally theistic, meaning to say it's compatible with theistic religions, but it's also compatible with non-theistic or atheistic individuals or groups, right? So in the famous text called the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali makes that very clear when he says that in his opinion, believing in God and being devoted to God is enormously helpful on the path of yoga, but not required. Yoga works for atheists too. He just thinks it works a little bit less well, you know, a little bit less effective if you don't have the grace of God, which for Patanjali anyway was an important concept. We'll talk about other versions of yoga, of course. I'm just pointing out that it's optionally theistic, and that's why we get in pre-modern India, I mean, not just the modern period. In pre-modern India, there were also atheists, and some of them practiced yoga. So we get this Venn circle diagram then, where yoga overlaps with all the religions that were around in India at the time, as well as with no religion. You know, so some people practiced yoga not in a theistic context, and that's of course true today. But yoga was always a spiritual discipline. I want to be clear about that. So what's new in the modern period is people doing yoga in a non-spiritual way, meaning to say as an exercise regimen or something like that. That's completely new, because for all the history of yoga up to the modern period, it was a spiritual discipline. So that might raise the question for some of you, how can it be a spiritual discipline if it can be atheistic? Well, because the central sort of teaching or concept for yoga is not in fact God, but the innermost self, or essence nature. So if you're doing yoga in a Buddhist context, they just don't like the word self for reasons we'll come to. But they often use the term sort of essence nature, at least in tantric forms of Buddhism, or just pure awareness, right? The Buddhists who don't like who believe in no essentiality to anything, still talk about pure awareness, and that is precisely what some of the yogins mean when they say innermost self. What is that innermost self? It's your fundamental awareness of being. So your innermost self is not, as most Americans conceive it, some kind of special thing about you that differentiates you from others. It's not that at all, not in yoga anyway. The innermost self is precisely your fundamental sense of aliveness or being, which is the same in all beings. It's not personal. It's not unique to you, which is a bit odd because it's the most fundamental part of you. I mean, it's odd from our cultural perspective that the most fundamental aspect of your being should be entirely not unique to you. And it's also considered the most sacred aspect of your being, partially for that very reason that you share it with all beings, right? So even say a dog who can't reflect on their own condition, they can't sort of think philosophically, they can't sort of look back on their life and see how they've grown. They don't have that self-reflective awareness. But even a dog or another animal is aware, right? It has a sense of its own being. It just can't reflect on it in a sense, right? But it still has consciousness, right? So that consciousness is the same in all beings. It's just that humans have this self-reflective ability as well. Possibly others, maybe the whales are swimming around doing philosophy in their heads. It could be. How would we know? But certainly humans, that's all we know for sure, have this self-reflective ability, which in Sanskrit is called vimarsha, which means awareness touching itself, sort of folding back on itself and touching itself, whereas most animals and beings don't have that capacity. So, having said that then, just very briefly kind of putting out some basic concepts, that the central idea in yoga then, what you're attuning to in a fundamental way is this sort of ground of your being, is this essence nature, or inner self, right? And it's actually, in a certain sense, the simplest part of you. And the thing is that people don't access it primarily because they're overthinking it. They hear about it and then they try to find it. But you can't find the ground of your being as an object of awareness. Do you see what I mean? You can find everything else as an object of awareness. It's like hand. There it is. I'm aware of it. I focus on it. Oh, I feel it. I see it. Da-da-da. So anything you can find as an object of awareness, meaning something that you can focus on and see or feel or think about, if it's intangible. But how can you see the place from which all seeing is done? You can't. So when you go looking for yourself, you don't find yourself. And then people are like, oh, I must have got it wrong. Or maybe I don't have that special part of me that everybody else in the universe has. Maybe I'm the only one without an inner self. So what happens is people think they're not finding the inner self or the basic consciousness precisely because they don't get that you can't find it as an object. You can't see it or touch it, right? But you can be it. And so how do you be your innermost self? Well, it's simply, one way the tradition talks about it is when you relax out of all your self-images, when you relax out of grabbing onto these thoughts about yourself, memories, or self-images, or what people have told you about you, all the stories about you, when you just stop grabbing onto that, when you stop grabbing onto anything, when you just let yourself repose and relax in awake awareness of your own existence, boom, that's it. That's it right there. And you can do it anytime. You can do it while I'm talking right now, because you can drop out of analytical, critical mind. Not that that's a bad thing. Critical mind's very important tools. But you have to be able to drop out of them at will, according to yoga. And then you go back to the critical mind and use it as a tool, and then you drop out again. So at any moment, you can drop out of analytical, critical, thinking, reacting mind, and just drop into this simple, basic awareness. And if you do it now, what it feels like is that my words are just falling into this open space of awareness and just dissolving in that space. And that space, you notice, is very receptive. It just accepts whatever arrives. It doesn't approve it or disapprove it. Awareness itself doesn't react. It's the mind that reacts. So you just feel the words just falling into that open space. And there's something almost kind of sacred feeling about it. It's like, and you can do it with anything, You can do it with just, looking at a butterfly, hearing a child laugh or cry, or anything. You can just let it come into the open space of awareness without going into reactivity. With practice, you can suspend reactivity and just be with what is. So that is accessing essence nature, or inner self, or pure awareness, whichever term you're using. Okay? So it's really, really simple to access it. It's way easier than people think. What's difficult is to learn to abide in it, even when life is being challenging. So when people are pushing your buttons, you go into reactive mind, and reactive mind takes possession of the system and defends or counterattacks, right? So it takes a lot of practice to be able to just be in awareness while you're receiving somebody who's maybe being aggressive or critical of you, That's just one example, right? It might be also difficult, say, in traffic. It might be difficult in many, 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 many examples in life. So in yoga, I just want to say two things, but before we start the history portion, which is, one, that there's a misunderstanding in the modern yoga world, a big misunderstanding, that accessing the inner self or essence nature is somehow very difficult and rare, and that only exalted yogis can do it, or something like that. Absolutely wrong, just completely wrong, okay? Because everybody does it. In fact, it happens spontaneously in the lives of people not doing yoga. They just don't necessarily know how to do it on cue, if you see what I mean. It's something that happens. And the thing is, our society doesn't give it much value. When you have these moments of presence, moments of quiet presence, and you just kind of drop in. What is someone who's socially, culturally conditioned in our culture will go, whoa, hello, get back into reactive mode because I'm not comfortable with you just being over there. Okay, they don't say that, but that's what's behind it when they go, whoa, hello. Do you see what I mean? So the culture is actually, our culture is actually organized in such a way as to make us uncomfortable with moments of quiet presence. in others primarily, less so in ourselves, especially if no one else is around, you know. So we have these moments, but we don't attribute that much significance to them. Whereas India was a culture, not anymore, but for a long time it was a culture that attributed significance to being in presence. And therefore, this kind of whole, you know, yoga thing grew up around that sense of significance. Okay, so again, not hard. It's not hard to access for a few moments, but it's hard to abide in. And that's what all the practices are oriented towards, to allow us to actually abide in essence nature more frequently, until finally it's almost all the time, you know, which is not, by the way, a thought-free state. It's just a state where you don't identify with the thoughts. You don't think that you're the thinker of the thoughts. Okay, thoughts actually arise spontaneously due to the mental programming, right? Your mind is programmed how to think by language and culture, and then it does its job. It's an organ that excretes thoughts, and it does it, you know. But you don't have to identify with it. You can be the awareness presence that picks up thoughts and uses them when they're useful to connect with others or to do something, and lets them be when they're not useful. You can be the awareness presence that, to use a specialized term, hosts everything in your experience. So the awareness presence hosts thoughts, it hosts feelings and emotions and sensations, and notice it never judges those things, because it can't. It doesn't even have the capacity to judge. It's the mind that has this judgmental capacity or faculty. Awareness presence just lets everything be. Even so-called negative emotions like anger, you know, or fear, or desire. Awareness presence just lets those be. It's totally fine with them. It's the conditioned mind that thinks, oh, I shouldn't be feeling this. You know, it's just kind of odd. But so awareness presence hosts everything, and it just responds. It doesn't even respond. It just allows for the organic flow of the pattern of energy called thought or feeling or whatever, sensation. Okay, so that's good, I think, for an intro. It's hard to say something that all the different branches of yoga would agree with, and it's always debatable when you're trying to do that. But you know, what I've just been talking about is something that represents a large majority of the way the different branches of yoga talk about this. They use different language and stuff, but part of what I try to do is find what is in common among all the different branches of yoga, because they disagree on so many things, but they agree on a lot of fundamental things, okay, like the goal of the path, that the goal of the path is being awake to your true nature and being free of attachment to all that is not your true nature. We call that liberation. That freedom is called liberation, which is a translation of a Sanskrit word that means this freedom from most suffering, because most suffering is actually mind-created. So freedom from mind-created suffering is freedom from most suffering. And how does that happen? Through freedom from attachment to all that is not your essence nature, all that is not your fundamental being, right? Which includes your body, your mind, your thoughts, your memories, as well as, of course, everybody else's, you know? So what does freedom from attachment mean? It means not grabbing onto, clinging onto, trying to control or manipulate, trying to keep any of those things. Thoughts, feelings, memories, desires, other people's or your own. It doesn't mean pushing them away either. That's called aversion. So yoga is, in many sources, defined as a kind of state of freedom from attachment and aversion. Freedom from clinging and grasping, and freedom from pushing away. Okay, so that is freedom. That's a feeling of freedom that pervades your whole life if you can access it. So most every branch of yoga agrees about why are we doing yoga? Okay, it's awakeness, to be awake to your true nature, and freedom. Like almost total agreement that that is the goal, and that those are two sides of the same coin. Okay. That leaves aside for now the fact that there's another sort of tertiary goal of yoga, which some people were interested in, which is basically how to be really good at life. Siddhi gets translated as sort of magical powers, but it's really, I mean, some of them are magical powers, yes, but it's also like things like charisma, how to win friends and influence people. It's that kind of thing. That's what Siddhi actually means, accomplishment, being good at life. So that was a tertiary goal in the sense that most of the sources agree that if that's what you want out of yoga, it will give you that, but probably this whole awakening and liberation thing will be next life. Like that is the general agreement. That that yoga can give you siddhi and bhoga, right? Ability to do life much more successfully according to the, standards of your culture. But that focusing on that pushes back the goal of liberation for obvious reasons, because you're grabbing onto something when you're pursuing siddhi, which is you're grabbing onto I want to be good at life, and I want everyone to know that I'm good at life, So that's not non-attachment, and it's also not a problem, right? Because attachment's not a sin. It's just what you eventually need to let go of if you want freedom and awakeness. Okay, but if you want to attain siddhi, fine. Okay, so that's a little bit about the fundamental assumptions about yoga and the goal. And now we'll get into a little bit of the history. Okay, so history part 1. The first thing we need to do is some myth busting, because the common misconception is that yoga is 5,000 years old. Well, you hear different figures, 3, 5, 7,000, even more sometimes. Okay, so I'm a scholar practitioner, which means that I will not entertain or repeat propositions that have no evidence to support them. Okay, so that evidence, sometimes it's empirical and personal on the spiritual path, and sometimes it's hard evidence that everyone can look at. But if there's no evidence, well, we have to remain skeptical, right? So some people like to say, well, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we don't have any evidence that yoga is 5,000 years old doesn't mean it's not. Well, obviously. Skepticism, true skepticism is being open, saying, I don't know, maybe it's 5,000 years old, maybe it's not. But that's different from asserting a proposition, you see. So why did people get the idea that yoga is 5,000 years old? Well, it's a bit of a long story, but here's the short version. So about 100 years ago, some ruins were excavated, and it turned out, after a bunch of study, that these ruins belong to a civilization that flourished along the Indus River when what is now Pakistan, but then was all part of India, And this civilization called the Indus Valley Civilization flourished from 25 or 2800 BC to about 1800 BC. And these are in the notes for this course. You don't have to write it all down. I'll give you a PDF. So this Indus Valley Civilization was quite an amazing civilization. It was almost as advanced as Egypt. It had, indoor plumbing and all kinds of stuff and it was really impressive. And they, in fact, traded their beautiful jewelry all over the ancient world, including with Egypt. And anyway, it's a fascinating thing to study. But here's what happened, is that this particular seal was found. So in the civilization, they found thousands of these little squares, like literally about this big, called seals, because they would use them to put marks on clay pots before they were fired, and we don't know what they meant. They have little writing on them that nobody can read. It's this indecipherable ancient language. But anyway, one of these seals has a figure who's obviously a kind of deity that's got a special headdress that almost looks like horns, and he's surrounded by animals. He's like a lord of beasts of a kind, and he's got his hands basically like this on his knees, and he's in a posture that literally thousands of years later would be called either Siddhasana or Baddhakonasana. It's hard to see because it's a very small little thing, but he's certainly in a posture like that, So, and what happened, and he might have three faces. This is hard to see also. Does he have two profiles of two other faces, or is that part of his headdress? Who knows? You can look it up online. It's called the proto-Shiva or the proto-yogi seal, and those names give away where this is going. The fact that people saw this image 100 years ago and said, oh my gosh, this must be the earliest image of Shiva, and he's in a yogic posture. Turns out that was wishful thinking, because we have a massive gap in the evidence of 2,000 years before we see anything like that again, that we could possibly connect. Okay, so, and when we do, it's very different. We can't be sure that this figure is Shiva at all. It's just a few points of coincidence. He's got beasts around him, and Shiva later, thousands of years later, is called the Lord of Beasts. And he's got this sort of, triple horned headdress that's vaguely like Shiva's, very vaguely like Shiva's trident. And the posture is, it could be just basically a simple cross-legged posture. It's just too vague to see. You can't call it a yogic posture. It's this little, cut image on this thing. There's more than one. There's a dozen or something of this particular image, but they're greatly outnumbered by other images on seals. Many, 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 many other images. So it's not a frequently occurring image. Anyway, so the oldest that image could possibly be is 2500 BC. Hence, round up 5,000 years from before now, right? So yoga's 5,000 years old now, but so this is, I hope I've convinced you that this is just irresponsible kind of statement based on insufficient evidence, totally insufficient evidence, because again, we have nothing in the evidentiary record for 2,000 years after that. Nothing that we could specifically call yogic. Okay, so when did yoga actually begin? Where does the evidence start appearing? Well, again, those are not necessarily the same thing, because we could have centuries in which it was happening with no surviving evidence. It's possible. But let's remember that starting from about 1500, India was a very literate culture. And I don't mean literate in terms of reading and writing, because that didn't exist yet, but they developed methods of memorizing orally composed texts and passing them on for generations. And the mnemonic science in ancient India is absolutely stunning. I don't have time to get into that. But this is what specially trained people could do. If you've ever seen a copy of the Iliad and the Odyssey, or if you can visualize kind of the New Testament, about how thick that is, these guys could memorize a text of that length, the entire New Testament, or the Iliad plus the Odyssey. They could memorize a text of that length and repeat it with almost zero errors, syllable for syllable. So it's like if you could recite the entire New Testament starting now, and a few hours later you're done, with only maybe one error in every 1,000 syllables. Right? So that mnemonic craftsmanship, I don't know what to call it, that mnemonic genius persists even today in India, although it's almost dead, it's almost gone. But it started in 1500 BC. So, and this has been verified by linguists, so we actually have texts that were not written, that survived for centuries before they were finally written down, many centuries. So the maximum about 15 centuries that some things survived in purely oral form. Okay, so point is, India was a literate culture from about 1500. So if yoga was around then and had any significance to the culture, we would expect them to talk about it. And we don't. We don't see any mention of it that old. And there's one possibility, very vague, if you want to look it up. It's in the Rig Veda, which is the oldest text in Sanskrit, but it's also the oldest text in any Indo-European language, not counting like record-keeping texts. It's the oldest poetic text in any Indo-European language. And this, the Rig Veda. And in the Rig Veda we have a hymn in the 10th book to the long hair. It's we could call it Hymn to the Hippies. And which is not just a joke, because these figures, these long-haired guys, were regarded somewhat as conservative. America regarded the hippies in the late 60s. Like, what are those guys doing? I don't know, I'm not sure. They're weirdos. But anyway, these long hairs are said to ride on the wind. What does that mean? Could they levitate? Who knows? Lots of speculation on this very vague hymn that is like 1200 BC or 1000 BC. That they ride on the wind and they drink the cup of poison with Rudra. What does that mean? Is it a reference to alchemy? Again, who knows? They wear some weird clothes, or they go almost naked and they have long hair. And this is about pretty much all the information we get. So some people say, oh, those are early yogis. Maybe. There's just not enough to go on. But anyway, if you accept that as evidence, that would put the origins of yoga to about 1000 BC, or 3000 years ago. So let's move forward just a little bit more. And we come to about 600 BC. Now we get abundant and solid evidence that continues all the way till now. Okay, so we have 2,600 years of continuous evidence of yoga. So if you're going to be, if you're going to base your assertions on evidence, then you would say yoga is about 2,600 years old, maybe a little more. Okay, so what is that evidence? Well, here we get into a little bit of a story. Before I even go there, I just need to note that we have misinformation circulating widely because of the politicization and nationalization of Hindu identity in the modern period. So what this means is that people who self-identify as Hindu want to claim yoga as theirs. Yoga is Hindu in origin, they say. And if you do not acknowledge yoga's Hindu-ness and Hindu origins, they say, you are culturally appropriating and you're being oppressing and you're being colonialist, and it's terrible. And I would absolutely agree with them if only it were true. That is to say, of course, yoga has an Indian, a South Asian origin, but it's not Hindu any more than it is Buddhist or Jain. And those religions are thought of as different from Hinduism by all scholars. Some modern Hindu nationalists say, oh, actually Buddhism is part of Hinduism, because the Buddha is the 9th avatar of Vishnu, or whatever other reason they want to give. But the vast majority of people and all scholars agree, no, we're considering these as different religions, Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism, and yoga has its origin in all of them and also none of them. meaning to say its origin was extra religious, and it certainly came about in environments that didn't observe these religious boundaries, and certainly there was no notion of Hindu or Hinduism at the time yoga emerged. Meaning to say, nobody used the word Hindu, nobody had a notion of Hindu identity yet. That's a feature of the last 1,000 years. Okay, so the concept of Hindu identity, as it's understood today, can be traced at a stretch about 1,000 years back. Again, this is for those who rely on evidence. And obviously fundamentalists and nationalists don't need to, they think. Both in the US and in India, it's the same. Nationalism and fundamentalism is the same everywhere. It's a kind of mental virus that can just spread in a culture. Don't get me started on that. The main point is, it's not actually true that yoga is Hindu, unless by Hindu you simply mean Indian. Then I agree. Yoga is Indian, for sure. And now it's global. But for most of its life, yoga is Indian. Now, but as we'll see soon, Buddhism, or the Buddha and his early movement, had as much to do with the formation of early yoga as anyone who we could maybe call Hindu. Okay, so having said that, what's the story? What actually happened? Well, these Hindu nationalists that I'm talking about today, they want to locate the origin of yoga in the Vedas. And their influence has been strong enough that yoga teacher trainings all over the world say, not all of them, but a lot of them say the origins of yoga are to be found in the Vedas, these early texts that weren't called Hindu at the time, but are now seen as the bedrock of Hinduism, the Vedas, right? These are these Brahminical texts. If you've heard of Brahmin priests, they wrote the Vedas, and they transmitted the Vedas. So this has become a commonly circulated misunderstanding. Because if we are to locate the origins of yoga anywhere, it's not in the Veda, it's in what scholars call the Sramana movement. So that's what I'm going to explain now. So right next to you, right there, you've got a book, The Roots of Yoga, right on top. Yeah, there we go. If you could pass that up. So I just want to mention Jim Mallinson and Mark Singleton's new book just came out, The Roots of Yoga. I know both these guys. They're good scholars. And I especially appreciate Jim Mallinson, who studied with my teacher at Oxford, and I first met him there. But anyway, the reason I'm presenting this book is as sort of corroborating evidence of what I'm about to say. I'm so glad it's out, because I've been saying this for some years now, and finally I can point to a sort, look, you see, they're saying the same thing. But scholars have been talking about it for years and years. It just hasn't been published in a general public book, that the origins of yoga are in what's called the Sramana movement, not the Vedas. So I'm going to explain what the Sramana movement is. To understand why the Sramana movement happened, we have to learn that in around 9 or 800 BC, India developed cities and urbanization and specialization and everything that goes with that. So what happened at that time was called economic surplus. Agricultural surplus, which equals economic surplus. Why does this matter in a history of yoga? You're about to hear. It's super important. When a culture produces only just as much as it needs to feed its people, there's no surplus, and there's also no money, and there's no trade. Okay? When a culture produces more than it needs, economic surplus, then they develop money to represent that surplus, and then they have trade, and then they have specialization, greatly increased specialization, and then they have hierarchies, and then they have wealthy and poor, and then haves and have-nots, oppression, society as we know it comes about due to economic surplus, right? So this happened for the first time in the early first millennium BC in India. And what happened is this increased urbanization, stratification of society, the caste system, which was originally just a loose class system, kind of started getting stronger, and everyone needs to be in their place, you know. And that led to some social challenges and health challenges, right? As you might know, urbanization in the ancient world meant much shorter lifespans and a lot more disease, because if you put a bunch of people really close together without modern sanitation, it's a shit show, literally and figuratively, and people have shorter lifespans and more disease. So what happened was, then, some people started ideologically rebelling against this relatively new development, you know. Couple of centuries into this development, people are like, you know what, something's gone wrong here. We used to live more in nature, in harmony with nature, in accord with nature. Now we've got these cities, we've got, you know, death and disease are more common, we've got, you know, people on top with more and people on the bottom with less, and, you know, this is a problem. So this kind of, I'm totally generalizing, of course, of a complex cultural thing. But what happened was this kind of criticism of where society had gone crystallized into a movement that we call the Sramana movement, which saw the solution in what you might call religious or spiritual terms, right? So these people, the Sramanas, now Sramana means striver, a striver for the truth. Okay, that's a term that was used then. We're not just back projecting it. So these strivers for the truth, these Sramanas, what did they actually do? They said, we are for getting back to nature, going and forming communes in nature. These communes were called ashrams. So notice the term ashram, shramana. So Shramanas formed ashrams, which means places of great striving. A is an intensifier, shram, strive, in this case, to strive for the truth. So these communes were formed that were in nature, and the whole idea was we reject the normal social values and cultural values, and we are going to discover the true meaning of human existence, mainly by sitting around and doing nothing. Now, so it's some parallels to perhaps to the hippie movement circa 1970, right? But the sitting around and doing nothing actually was a lot more involved in that, because what to others looked like doing nothing was actually doing psychophysical practices that were often very involved, but the body would generally be motionless while you did these practices. So what we have now of like yoga asanas in a vinyasa flow, nothing like that existed, and not for many, many, many centuries, you know. So mainly people doing yoga would be still, okay? Not always in this posture, right? They could be in any number of different postures. They could be hanging upside down. They could be, you know, lying on the ground with their legs in the air. They could be, or against a tree. They could be, you know, standing on one leg. They could be in a variety of seated postures, you know. And none of these were called asanas, and none of these were seen as all that important. They were just, you know, it was just in general, if you're doing yoga, you're holding still for quite some time. And it wasn't doing nothing for the most part, because it included breathing in certain ways, directing the attention in certain ways, and we'll come to that. Okay, but the point is, there was tension in society at that time, enormous tension, because the establishment was essentially saying, no, this is not good, this Sramana movement. So, because a lot of young people would get zealously fired up about the Sramana movement, and they would essentially, you know, run away from home. I mean, you know, if you're 20, you're you're of age, you're an adult in that society, so you're not really running away in the same sense. But run away from home and join the Sramana movement, and of course their parents would be very upset because they want them to marry a nice girl, settle down, inherit the family business. The same then as now. Like certain aspects of Indian society have not changed at all in thousands of years. And there are human aspects too, of course. So here's the point. Young people joining the Sramana movement and also marking their rejection of normal social values in this very, very physical way. How? Because almost all the Sramanas would do one of two things with their hair. Shave it all off. Those are called the mundas or the mundakas. There's a mundaka Upanishad, by the way. Shaven-headed guys. And then others would grow their hair long and let it mat up into dreadlocks, which they called jata. And there are some exceptions, but generally all of them would do one of these two things because both were so different from normal society, And they would also mark their rejection of social norms in clothing by lack thereof, wearing a little loincloth or nothing. Or wearing, if they were more modest, they would wear these robes. And these robes that the Sramanas wore were of a particular type, because there was a special way you were supposed to get your robe. And you'll see in a minute why this matters. You would, as a Sramana, you would find rags that had been thrown in the trash by people or cast off. You would find bits of cloth and rags, and you would stitch them together. And then you would make a tub of water and put a bunch of turmeric in it. Turmeric root, which would make the water yellow-orange, right? And then you take your robe and you dip it in there and let it soak, because turmeric stains better than anything in the world, maybe, if you've cooked with it. And then they let the robe dry, and boom, they have a yellow-orange robe that marked them as a Sramana. And guess what? That still is happening today, not in that way. But today, swamis and sannyasins wear these yellow-orange saffron robes because of the Sramana movement. They don't know that's why, because people, by and large, people in South Asian culture don't study South Asian history, unfortunately, with rare exceptions. But anyway, that's why the robes are yellow-orange today, is the Sramana movement. And now they wear the monks will wear silk robes made of, that are that color. But originally it was more rustic. So, because there were no institutions yet, very loose institutions in the Sramana movement. Anyway, getting to the fundamental point, which is these young people would go and join the Sramana movement, fired up about, I want to discover the true nature of reality and the meaning of human life and reject normal society. And it was entirely unlike the American and Western hippie movement in a certain way, because they entered into a life of great discipline, which is not what hippies were known for. Great discipline and usually celibacy. Okay, but that also allowed their communes, their ashrams, to persist for long periods of time. Because it turns out, if you've got a small commune and people are having sex with each other, the whole thing falls apart pretty quickly, as the hippies discovered in the 70s. There's fascinating histories of 70s attempts at communal living and how it all went south. But in this context, by maintaining celibacy, and there were some women practitioners around, not many as far as we know, but there were some, right? Sometimes called sadhvis, right? Sadhus and sadhvis, male and female. Renunciate practitioners, celibate communes, were able to persist for much longer, ashrams. So here's the main point that I've been driving towards, which is the establishment society wanted to say, look, this is not okay, but the movement was too strong to just, try to quell it. So they said, the proper time, if you want to renounce and go to the forest and join an ashram, the proper time to do so is when you're a grandparent. And there's a saying, there's this whole thing in Sanskrit, it says, this teaching that they circulated, the more establishment types. When you have seen your hairs turn gray, when you have seen your grandchildren born, and more things in the list, I forget, but those are the main ones. Then you may go to the forest. Then you may become a renouncer. Then you may wander forth and join one of these ashrams, right? So there's different terms for that. You can, so in Buddhism they say parivrajaka, wandering forth, meaning going into the wilderness and practicing solo, which was an option, or joining one of these ashrams. So establishment society tried to control this by saying it is morally correct to do this only when you have perpetuated the species. You know, you've had kids, they're starting to have kids, okay, you can go renounce. Now, the younger people in the movement made the argument, some of them anyway, well, we don't agree because by that time your prana is depleted, you're older, you don't have as much fire for the path, and you need fire to succeed in this radical search for truth. Okay, so what truth exactly were they searching for? Well, it was articulated in different ways, but one of the main sort of questions in the Sramana movement was the following. The Sramana movement was concerned with mortality because, again, part of the reason it started is because of seeing more death and disease in the cities, right? We can't even imagine. Imagine if, like, almost any given day you walk out of your house and you see a corpse, you know, because it's laid out on the street for collection or whatever, or somebody, you know, just died there or whatever. It's like, if it's a common sight, you know, like, you're not going to be able to ignore the fact of death the way people can in our society, right? Because in our society, death is obsessively hidden. We just don't notice how obsessive it is because we're so used to it. It's obsessively hidden and hidden away. So nobody sees death. Nobody sees corpses. But then they were. So you couldn't avoid it. And they were like, you know, it made people ask, what's the point of life? Because when you're confronted with death, it's the natural thing for a human consciousness to say, well, what's the point of life if we're going to die? Very, very natural. So the way the Sramanas phrased it was more precise and fruitful than just saying, what's the point of life? They said, we know because the Buddha loved this and he repeated it, but it was a Sramana movement question. We find it in other sources too, but it was one of the Buddha's favorite questions in his seeking, which is, what, if any, is the meaning or point of human life? Okay, let me start again. It's hard to say. Is there a meaning of human life so profound that knowing it would make life seem worthwhile even in the face of death? That's the question. I'll say it again. Is there a point or meaning to human life sufficiently profound to make life seem worthwhile even in the face of death? So what the Sramanas wanted is to be able to face death full in the face and say, it's totally fine that we're all going to die. It's totally fine that I'm going to die because I've discovered something about human existence that makes it worthwhile, even in the face of death. And see, this is a very well formulated question, because what most people do is they find value in life by denying death, by pushing it away, by forgetting about it, you know. These guys wanted to be able to confront it and still feel value in life, right? So how do we do that? Okay, so as you might have guessed by now, the Buddha, the person who became the Buddha, was a Sramana. He was, in fact, a card-carrying member. He was a poster boy for the Sramana movement, just using those phrases colloquially, meaning to say he was a zealous adherent to Sramana doctrines. He developed kind of original ideas later, but he started out as, you know, I'm 100% dyed-in-the-wool Sramana. So his early teaching that became Buddhism, as well as the early teaching that became Jainism, they are birthed by the Sramana movement. So the Sramana movement, I argue, Mallinson argues, other people argue, the Sramana movement birthed not only Buddhism and Jainism, which everyone agrees, but also birthed yoga. Now, there may have been little threads of vaguely yogic-like things around before that, but we don't see a coherent practice that looks that we could call yoga before the Sramana movement. And the first people we see doing what we could call yoga, a psychophysical practice utilizing mind-body connection and breath exercises and meditation and concentration and holding still for long periods and going into silent retreat, all of that was there in the Sramana movement. It's fully present. Okay, so just to recap, practicing silence, silent retreat, practicing dietary restrictions, practicing meditation, concentration, breath exercises to attain sometimes altered or higher states of consciousness, sometimes more fundamental states of consciousness. All of that is there in the Sramana movement, and that's yoga. I mean, yoga added more practices over the years, but that's it right there. It's already there, and it's not there before. Not all of those elements, not even close. So just to clarify, this is how we come to conclusions as scholars, is we look at our sources and we see which explanation is the most persuasive or probable given the evidence, and the only way you can do that is if you don't have an ideological investment, you see. And this is the big problem in the debate between scholars and Hindu nationalists, for lack of a better word, is that the scholars have no vested interest. They don't care, really, whether yoga came from the Vedas or the Sramana movement or somewhere else. Whereas Hindus have a very powerful vested interest in proving that everything comes from the Vedas. And sometimes that gets extreme, like they argue that the Vedas encode, in secret code, information about physics and how to build a nuclear bomb, for example. People actually say that. Those are the extreme examples. But they certainly want to find everything religious and spiritual and philosophical in Indian tradition somehow comes from the Vedas, So the thing is, if you don't start with that ideology, then, and you're just open, that's not what you naturally conclude. Okay? So scholars use a principle called Occam's razor, which is all other things being equal, the simplest explanation is always the best. Sometimes all other things aren't equal, but it means to say, simplest means the most economical explanation. The explanation that accounts for the data in the cleanest way, with the least add-on bells and whistles, you know what I mean? This is the most economical explanation. So, when we look at the Vedas, and here I'm not counting the Upanishads after 300 BC, because those are full of yoga. But the early Upanishads and the rest of the Vedas, we find little threads of yogic ideas and practices here and there, but we don't find as any kind of a comprehensive or coherent thing that we could call yoga, and we don't find the texts using the word yoga in a spiritual way. It's a little confusing because the word yoga was there in the early sources in a literal way, where yoga means yoking horses to a chariot, right? And the reason you have to be very, very clear and precise in your thinking is because later, yoking horses to a chariot became a yogic metaphor, right? But it's very clearly a metaphor. They actually spell out the metaphor, as I will in a minute. But in early Vedas, yoga just meant, it's like when the warriors were ready for battle, they would be like, call for the yoga! And that meant yoke the horses to the chariot, call for the yoke, so that we can go into battle and kick some ass. So it has nothing to do with what yoga would later mean, okay? So words change their meanings over time, and if you're ideologically invested in a particular agenda, you can just ignore that fact, or you need to ignore that fact. Okay, moving on from that though, the point is that we find threads of yogic ideas in these early sources, but we find this coherent and complete thing that looks like yoga in the Sramana movement, with all the elements are there. Not all the philosophical elements, right? Because people were still very vague and inchoate, and they were just forming the philosophical ideas in the Sramana movement. Very, very, very vague. And the only reason we know about them is because, thank God, that the Buddha's words were written down so carefully, because he describes a bunch of different teachers in the Sramana movement, including surprising ones. There was a whole subsect of the movement that was materialist, meaning they argued only material reality is true. There's no soul, there's no spirit, we're just made of these 4 or 5 elements, and when we die, it falls apart and there's nothing. There's no after death. Those are called the Charvakas. They were part of the Sramana movement, right? But they were all meditating, because everyone agreed that meditation, sitting still and looking within and really deeply contemplating on a kind of beyond conceptual level, that somehow is the main way we're going to figure out the truth. That is the agreement that sort of united the Sramana movement, because what we find is that every single group was meditating, even these materialists, and they're the more extreme example. So the Buddha goes through these 6 different groups he talks about, that he thinks are wrong, that were around at his time, and many of them which were not around later, So there's many ways in which we can, both from the Buddha's lectures, which of course were written down later, but due to oral tradition, preserve a lot of the Buddha's original words. And through other sources, right, like early strata of the Mahabharata, we find some information about these early figures. Okay, so point is that, and you can read more about it in the Roots of Yoga a little bit, and you have to look at extra Sanskrit sources too. You have to look at Pali sources, like the Buddha's lectures. So Sramana movement, gave rise to what was not yet called yoga, of course, but yogic practices and yogic theories of practice. Because even though the philosophy wasn't fully developed metaphysically, theory of practice was there, meaning to say body-mind connection, or rather body-mind spectrum, meaning to say this idea, which is new in the West, it's fairly new in Western philosophy, is very old there in the East, in India, because it was put in this way. The body is the most tangible expression of mind. Mind is the least tangible expression of body. So that's to say a spectrum, right? So again, body is the most tangible expression of mind, and mind is the least tangible expression of body. So if you contemplate that, you realize, wait a second, these guys weren't just talking about a mind-body connection. They're saying this is all one thing with these different aspects to it, and a kind of gradation from coarse to subtle, from stula to sukshma in Sanskrit language. So that means that everything that happens in the mind, especially repeatedly and persistently, is going to affect the body somehow, right? And Western medicine is just starting to acknowledge that with the word stress, where stress means stuff that's happening in your thoughts and emotions is affecting the health of your body. That's all stress means. That's what the word is trying to point to, right? So, and it's a catch-all term, right? Because they still don't know very many specifics about how mental emotional states impact bodily health, right? In Western medicine. Don't really understand that, but they say stress. But by the same token, things you do with your body can affect your mind, right? And that's also important. And so that's the rationale by which we even have asanas today. They didn't have these asana sequences back then, and they didn't have more than, about a couple dozen specific asanas back then. But the idea that what you do with the body affects the mind. Now, for them, it wasn't so much physical postures back in the Sramana movement, it was more breath. Breath is something you do with the body that affects the mind. So how did this come about? Well, in the context of this mind-body connection, they were like, okay, wait a second. We've noticed, I'm simplifying it here, we've noticed that when we're anxious, we breathe in a certain way. The breath is higher in the chest, it's more shallow, it's more rapid, it's more ragged. And when we're contented and at peace, we notice our breath is deeper, more regular, more smooth and even. So wait a second, does that mean, because mind, body both ways, does that mean we could change our breathing patterns and thereby change our mental emotional state? Lo and behold, it's true. You can. You can make yourself more anxious if you want, right? By how you're breathing. And you can make yourself calmer, right? And this was one of the central discoveries of early yoga. And it's one that, curiously, is still not being taken fully seriously in modern yoga. People talk about pranayama, and they do pranayama, and they'll do, rapid breathing or certain kinds of pranayama. But if you really understood the principle, you would use it in your everyday life, not just in yoga classes. Meaning to say, you would realize, holy cow, in 5 minutes of deeper, slower, more even and smooth breathing, I can totally change my mental emotional state in 5 minutes. It's a magic key that it's, to me, stunning that millions of people are not doing this, right? Because what happens is you get, in your day, you get a kind of mental momentum, mental physical momentum of I'm getting stuff done, and you don't think you can check that. That's one reason. And it's a kind of trance. And this is actually how yoga talks about it, that people get into a trance, and in trance you can't remember what really helps. You can't remember what makes a difference if you're in this kind of a trance. And we get in doing trance. So in yoga, if you're really taking it seriously, it's not something you just do for a part of the day. It's like, oh, I've gotten scattered. I've gotten out of my center, decentered, I'm feeling all over the place. Oh, that's no problem. I'll just take 5 to 7 minutes to breathe. Problem solved, And it works every time. It doesn't always, of course, bring you to the exact same place of peace and contentment, right? But it always works. It always improves your mental emotional condition, makes you more centered, grounded, calm, able to see other options, right? It's part of what yoga does. It expands the possibilities, right? So, anyway, that's my little pep talk for that particular practice that these guys discovered way back then. So pranayama, in a very basic sense, not these complex pranayamas you get later, but a very basic sense of pranayama was there in this early period.